Recording. And welcome, everyone. We're so glad you've joined us today for the Bridging the Power Gap, a summer of exploration into energy equity in North Carolina webinar. My name is Susanna Tuttle, and I'm the Director of Strategic Engagement at the North Carolina Council of Churches. It's my pleasure to share a little bit about the Council's history and mission with you all. Founded in 1935 to address racial inequality, the North Carolina Council of Churches was quite possibly the first place in North Carolina, or even the Southeast, where white and Black leaders sat together as equals around the same table to address issues of mutual concern to all. Our members include 27 judicatories of 19 denominations and 7 individual congregations. Across the state, our members have over 6,200 congregations. We reach into every corner of North Carolina with a presence in nearly every neighborhood and community. Last year, we celebrated our 90th anniversary. And when you go to our website at ncchurches.org, you will find a tremendous wealth of information on the issues we care about, along with many resources, including our most recent publication, our Faithful Voter Guide, a nonpartisan educational resource designed to help voters engage public life through the lens of faith, reflection, and faithful civic participation. So every month, I've had the pleasure of facilitating the Council's online Eco Justice Connection Advocacy Forum to provide opportunities to listen to and learn from our guest speakers and explore education, inspiration, and mobilization opportunities for us all as we work together to protect the people and places that we love. So far in 2026, I've had the honor of hosting webinars on a variety of topics with speakers from the Carolinas Clean Energy Fund, North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, Utility Fairness Now campaign, and the U.S. Climate Action Network. Today, I am thrilled to host one of my newest friends and colleagues, Georgia Rabin. This is the last week of Georgia's internship with the North Carolina Council of Churches Eco Justice Connection Program, and we are excited to hear about both the energy equity research and analysis she has been leading, along with the fascinating experiences she has been having this summer working and living during their 8-week summer residency as a bridge intern. So with that, it is my great pleasure to hand it over to you, Georgia. Take it away.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you all so much for being here. I've had a really fantastic summer and experience working with Susanna, and I'm really excited to share a little bit about what I've learned and what I've worked on with you all today. So thank you for taking the time, and yeah, I look forward to diving in. Um, but before I introduce myself in just a second, I wanted to start this webinar the same way that Susanna and I started many of our meetings this summer with a practice that she introduced to me. And that was one of us would always bring a centering, which could be a piece of art, a poem, something like really anything that inspired us, and sort of just use it as an opportunity to come together and start a meeting with some inspiration. So for today's centering, I have a photo that I took of a painting made by a member of the congregation at Judea Reform, which is a synagogue that I visited this summer. And the painting is titled Discovering Nature, which I think is just vague enough that it leaves a lot open to the interpretation of the viewer. And at first glance, what I noticed that there's no nature really in the frame of the painting, which kind of allows viewers to imagine what the child might be seeing. But then upon further reflection with Susanna, I kind of realized that the child and the expression it has on its face is nature in and of itself, and the nature of who we are. So I just think it's a fun way to start today's talk and to get us thinking about humanity's place within and among nature, which is a topic that will come up again and again today. Okay, so some of you know who I am, know me very well, but some of you I've never met before. So I thought I'd start with sharing a little bit about myself and how I came to this work. So I'm a rising senior at Duke, where I major in public policy and minor in biology and economics. But before I came to Duke, I took a gap year to backpack in Bolivia and Peru. And there I lived in community with people that were deeply affected by resource extraction. And this got me really passionate about resource rights. And then when I came to Duke, I took a class on cyber policy and really got the chance to connect the dots between resource extraction and energy policy. And I've been really passionate about both issues ever since. And then from there, I started taking classes on the relationship between technology and national security. And these classes sort of shifted my perspective to think about energy security not only as an environmental justice issue, but also as a national security issue, and kind of thinking about both at the same time, which is like kind of an overlap that I'm not sure many people are thinking about. So that's where I really find a lot of my passion for this work comes from. And then what brought me to the Council of Churches is my multi-faith background. I've really benefited from a diverse religious education. I have a Jewish dad and a Christian mom, and I also bring this values-based decision-making framework to my work. I'm a longtime student of ethics, starting very, very young, and I'm lucky to work and have a relationship with Duke's Keenan Institute today. So still getting to learn and benefit from that kind of environment at Duke. So what I'm sure you're all asking is, what is the Bridge internships? This is like very confusing, sort of vague thing, but the program is a collaboration between Duke University and NC Central, and it's intended to encourage bridge building across typical divides. The program brings together 3 Duke students and 3 Central students, all with different faith backgrounds, to live together in a house for 8 weeks. And as a group, we've met with different faith leaders, community organizers, psychologists, and more to both look inward at the things that make us who we are and outward at the ways that we interact with people within and across social divides like race, religion, socioeconomic status, and more. The aim is to leave knowing how to be better bridge builders and to bring those skills and awarenesses back to our respective schools and communities. And we also obviously have spent a lot of time investing and building a community amongst each other. And then as a core part of the program, each student gets placed at a different internship site, and that is what brought me to the Council of Churches. These placements are based on our studies, passions, sense of purpose, and for me, the Council of Churches was a really great fit. And then I've also included on the right side of the screen some of the sites that my peers are working at, which includes like a homeless shelter, community shelter, youth detention center. So lots of interesting work going on. And this is the Bridge group. We've got the 6 students on the left, and on the right we have our leaders, our mentors, Pastor Gloria from NC Central and Reverend Bruce from Duke. And so we've done things like lots of volunteering. I've done everything from pruning trees on the street to packaging wardrobes for children in need of clothes. We've also done site visits, both to religious sites, like a Hindu temple, Buddhist temple, Jewish synagogue, historic sites like the Stagville Plantation and the National Civil Rights Museum, all sorts of different site visits. And then we also have spent lots of time just building community through lots of food, lots of meals, but also just every day that we live together. So that's a little bit about the Bridge program. But now, transitioning to the work that I did with the Council of Churches Eco-Justice team, I figured that the best place to start would be with the relationship between faith and environmental advocacy. So for those of you tuning in from the Council of Churches or other faith-based advocacy groups, my apologies if this is a bit of a review, but this was honestly one of the biggest things I feel like I learned about this summer, so I had to start here. And to learn about this deep-rooted connection between faith and environmental advocacy, my first undertaking this summer was reading Pope Francis's encyclical on care for our common home. So I figure no better way to start with you. And if you're not familiar with what an encyclical is, I was not either. It's a formal pastoral letter that's written by the Pope for circulation amongst the general public, both Catholic and beyond. And encyclicals are supposed to reflect the voice of God through the Pope, offering moral commentary and guidance on some of the most pressing contemporary issues. And it was 184 pages long, so there's a lot in there and a lot that I won't even begin to try and explain to you today. But one of his biggest themes is that Our relationship with the environment can never be isolated from our relationship with others and with God. And that is something that he expresses again and again in so many different ways, that everything is connected. Our cycle of consumerism impacts everybody all over the world, all living beings, the planet. And within that, he has this call to action that is also specific to believers, which is that as believers, we do not look at the world from without, but from within, conscious of the bonds with which the Father has linked us to all beings. And what he's really saying here is that it's a Christian duty to care for creation, not as some group that is separate from creation, but as this group that is embedded within creation. And I think that that is such a simple and beautiful truth that seems to have gotten really lost among the many other priorities and things sort of competing for our attention today. So connecting all of this back to the mission of the Council of Churches, Pope Francis does a beautiful job of weaving the thread between environmental justice issues and all sorts of other social issues when he says how inseparable the bond is between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. And that just really spoke to me. And then towards the end of the encyclical, he also reminds us to never lose our hope. And among the many different things that I think faith can bring to the environmental movement, perhaps this is like the most unique and special or profound. Environmental advocacy can feel so often like an uphill battle with no end in sight. And the hope that comes from faith in God can bring this unique sense of renewed strength to the environmental movement. So I thought that was like a really beautiful message. Okay, so clearly I could talk about the encyclical all day long, but I won't because we have so much more to talk about. But the last idea that I'll spotlight is his commentary on technological advances, to which he says that for every scientific or technological advance, there must be an accompaniment of a development in human responsibility, values, and conscience. Again and again, he refers to the critical importance of moral progress alongside technological progress. Unfortunately, however, our society doesn't really reward moral progress the same way it does technological. And so often moral progress really lags behind and is chasing around technological progress, which I think serves as a really good transition into what I've been focusing on with the Council of Churches this summer, and that is data centers and energy policy. Within the broad theme of environmental advocacy and eco-justice, the Council of Churches does a ton of work across a bunch of different focus areas. So Susanna let me pick, based on my academic and professional interests, what I wanted to focus on this summer. And after reading a bunch of headlines like this, and this, and this, I identified that data centers are one of the latest looming threats to environmental justice in North Carolina. But let me get a few things straight. First of all, data centers have actually been around for quite a while. North Carolina has over 90, a number that's been growing since the early 2000s. Places like the Duke Hospital have data centers for storing patient data, health research, and more. So we need to be really careful when we define the problem and when we talk about banning data centers outright, because the scope of their applications is really far broader than the recent news has made it out to be. But that being said, what makes what is happening now really different is that the boom in AI is leading to the construction of these new hyperscale data centers that are tens of thousands of square feet, house millions of servers, get really hot, and sometimes use enough electricity to power hundreds of thousands of homes. And while they certainly have their utility in medicine and national security and research and a host of other contexts, in a lot of ways that moral progress that Pope Francis referred to in his encyclical has not caught up with the rate at which these data centers are cropping up. So what's happening is tons of environmentally detrimental infrastructure is being put in place without the accompaniment of sufficient policy to sort of keep it in check. And as I'm sure many of you have read about in the news, data centers are increasing load demands on public energy, which has had a huge impact on energy access and affordability. So based on what I learned from the encyclical and based on a little bit of background that I had on the issue, I came up with this framework for how I'd look at the issue, knowing that energy decisions are simultaneously environmental, economic, and moral decisions. And with this framework in mind, I organized my summer around answering these 6 big questions, starting seriously with the basics. so that I could get to know the energy and regulatory landscape before approaching the data center question. And you don't have to read them all on the slide now because we're gonna go through them together. So first, with an awareness about what data centers are doing to the energy landscape, I had to go back to the most basic question before I could even attempt to figure out what needed to be done about it. And that was, where does most of our energy come from in North Carolina? And what I found is that Duke Energy's subsidiaries, Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas, provide energy for over 70% of North Carolina's retail electric customers. When I learned this, I was really surprised because it sounded a lot like a monopoly to me. So Susanna referred me to meet with Claire Williamson, who was a former utility resource planner and current energy policy advocate at the North Carolina Justice Center. And basically, I threw a bunch of questions at her, and she did an amazing job of helping me to understand. So what she taught me is that it's actually in the public's interest to have one provider because infrastructure costs are really, really high. And this makes it a natural monopoly. And I included a picture of a railroad here because railroads are another example of a really obvious natural monopoly. It would not make sense to have tons of railroads lined up next to each other, all going to the same places. And so it's another natural monopoly. But what does it really mean to be a public utility? Funnily enough, public utilities are usually private investor-owned entities, but they're considered to be public utilities because they are affected by the public interest. And because of that, they have an obligation to serve anyone that requests service within their service area. And their rates are meant to be regulated based upon the cost of service, which includes a reasonable rate of return. But in recent years, what's considered reasonable has really been called into question. But all of this context on Duke Energy was helpful, but I realized that I wasn't actually answering the question of where North Carolina's energy was coming from. So I had to dig one step deeper. And what I found from this report from the North Carolina Utilities Commission is that Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas get a majority of their energy from nuclear, natural gas and oil, and coal. And so while we see non-hydro renewables and like renewables on the chart, it's a very small percentage of energy that they account for. So how does North Carolina compare to the rest of the country? In some ways, North Carolina is ahead of the curve, and in other ways, North Carolina is falling behind. North Carolina is a bit ahead of the curve, sorry, on solar, and also on sort of ditching coal plants. But as you can see, they have outsized portions that are supported by nuclear and natural gas. Natural gas is a fossil fuel. It's technically considered to be like one of the cleaner fossil fuels, but it's a methane-based fuel source, and so it's still pollutive. And ideally, that's not what we're replacing all of our more pollutive fossil fuels with. But it's interesting to see how North Carolina compares to the rest of the country. Definitely, North Carolina does not have a wind industry or wind energy sector, which is there's room for growth there. Okay, so that's one question checked off, 5 to go. So then, knowing all this about energy in North Carolina, I had to ask the question, how do data centers actually impact energy access? And to answer this question, I thought I'd use Northern Virginia, the data center capital of the world, as a case study. As you can see on the map, Northern Virginia has over 600 data centers. And amazingly, I find this absolutely crazy, over 70% of the world's internet traffic passes through Northern Virginia somehow. And according to this article I read in Bloomberg, Dominion Energy, which serves Data Center Alley, forecasts its peak demand to rise by more than 75% by 2039 with data centers, whereas without the presence of data centers, it would rise by just 10%. So that's a huge increase in demand that can be accounted for by data centers. So to meet these projected increases in demand requires massive, absolutely massive investments into infrastructure. And these investments in infrastructure are reflected in rising energy rates. We see this most prominently in Northern Virginia, where energy rates went up more than 23% within 1 year between February 2025 and 2026, which was the highest increase in all of the country. Ideally, data centers are assuming all the costs associated with these infrastructure projects, and the projects are focused on clean energy, but unfortunately, in a lot of cases, this is simply not what's happening. And a recent Harvard study found that utility companies give preferential rates to tech firms a lot of the time, and the costs of which are often pushed onto residents, which means the utility company expands sales, the tech firm gets subsidized, and the residents have to pay. And we see this happening already in North Carolina. I pulled this chart from a Duke Energy rate case fact sheet, and you see that across the board, rates are going to go up, which makes sense because you have to account for inflation and everything that's going on in the world. But the really interesting discrepancy is that you see that residential rates are going to go up by a lot more than industrial rates, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because residential rates are relatively inelastic. They don't change too much, but industrial rates, with increased industry or the growth of the industry or data centers, like they are going to go up. So that's just really interesting to look at. Okay, so that's 2 questions down, 4 to go. The next question was, who has a say in these energy policy and projects, and how do they engage with one another? And the bottom line is that it's very confusing, but I'll try and make it simple. The 3 biggest players in the game are Duke Energy, the North Carolina Utilities Commission, and then public stakeholders, who are often organized, educated, and empowered by environmental advocacy groups and other NGOs. So, as the entity most familiar with what the utility actually needs to function, Duke Energy gets to draft and propose a lot of the important documents, like the carbon plan, the integrated resources plan, and the rate-making process. And then the Utilities Commission and public staff, which are 2 independent regulatory agencies, get the chance to evaluate and respond to Duke Energy's proposals, according to the interests of the state and of the using and consuming public. And the public staff in particular are meant to represent the public's interests. So one of my projects this summer was to take a closer look at the Utilities Commission and public staff, for which I created a power map, and this is just a small screenshot of a huge spreadsheet. And in the power map, I noted everyone's title, professional background, education, political party, potential conflicts of interest, any past statements, and I learned a lot about a lot of these people, which was cool. And something I found really interesting from this project was that the public staff is comprised of financial analysts, attorneys, regulatory analysts, and engineers, which means they have a lot of technical expertise. And while that level of technical expertise is important, I'm not necessarily sure that it makes the most sense for them to be the people representing the needs of the average ratepayer or the using and consuming public. Maybe I'm wrong, but when I first learned about the public staff, I'd honestly expected them to be sort of like random people from across the state rather than experts on energy and utilities. And then for the last of the 3 groups, I've grouped together the NGOs and public stakeholders, which is the group that encompasses you and me. And basically, NGOs get to intervene in rate cases, inform and organize the public. The public gets to deliver testimony in public hearings, offer written comments, all sorts of things. And sometimes it can feel like, as a member of the public, your voice is not really being heard or given equal weight, especially in the face of the opportunities for profit that data centers stand to offer. But a little piece of encouraging news is that this year, during the rate-making process, for the first time ever, Duke Energy reduced their rate voluntarily before like the formal intervening process that takes place. And this was a direct result of over 40,000 written comments submitted by the public and over 200 people showing up at public hearings in response to the initial rate case application. And that was the highest engagement that the Utilities Commission had ever seen. And even if just a little bit, it did pay off to some extent. So while it's true that the public's voice is not given the weight it deserves, that story is a testament to the fact that every voice does count for something. And if you're imagining that the collaborative process between these groups is organized and linear, I'd suggest that you think again. It's really messy. It lasts most of the year. There's a whole lot of back and forth. It's honestly messier than that squiggle implies right there, but it's super chaotic. And for me, to get the chance to sort of jump in and sort of observe how these groups were interacting, like I felt like I was playing catch up for a lot of the time, but I did learn a lot. Okay. Now 3 down, 3 to go, halfway there. That's good. Okay. So the next question was, what are the most important energy related plans and documents that these groups work on? And I touched on this a little bit before when talking about the key players, but the first and probably most important document or plan is the rate making plan. And that's a really contentious process, as you can imagine. It happens every few years. And essentially, it determines how much these different groups, like residential, industrial, will pay for their energy in the coming year. And Duke Energy gets to file their initial application, and then the regulators and the public respond. And very early on in my internship, I attended a drag down our electric bills rally that involved a drag show and then was followed by a public hearing on Duke's request to raise electric bills. And this hearing was really impactful for me. I got the chance to hear from people that had traveled from all over the state to share their testimony on how increasing energy rates have impacted their lives. And I learned that the situation is the most dramatic for people who can't afford to upgrade the energy efficiency of their homes and therefore really struggle to keep the lights on. And I also learned that while Duke energy rates are lower than the national average, in recent years they've been going up like really dramatically at a rate which is much faster than the national average. And I think this has a lot to do with what's going on with the increasing load demands and projected load growth needed to support data centers in the state. Then you have the Integrated Resources Plan and the North Carolina Carbon Plan, which are two documents. One of them intended to address more like long-term resource planning, and the other one intended to reflect shorter-term planning associated with emissions. And in recent years, Duke Energy has sort of merged these documents into one plan, the Carolinas Resource Plan. And I could talk about that for a long time, but what I'll say is that you really have to question whether some of the original intention and integrity of these documents has been compromised when these documents have been combined into one, because they really had distinct purposes. And sort of from the start, in a lot of ways, Duke Energy has sort of worked outside the requirements of what these plans had in mind. And so it's just really interesting to see how these plans have evolved over time. And I really spent a lot of time on that this summer, but I won't get into it now. But all of these documents and plans are really interconnected. Sometimes like the closing of old coal plants is pinned on the build out of new nuclear projects. And so that has that, and then that gets into resource planning and rate making, because planning carbon goals on nuclear expansion allows Duke Energy to charge much higher rates because profits are earned as a percentage markup on capital investments, which incentivizes the build out of the most expensive possible energy projects and doesn't necessarily always have the ratepayer in mind, but ratepayer's best interest at heart. Okay, so that's 4 questions down. I promise we're getting closer to the end here. The next question I asked was, what is the relationship between these plans and North Carolina climate goals? So another one of my big undertakings for the summer was to track the evolution of climate goals, carbon plans, and resource plans in the state. And this involved looking at landmark legislation, plans, and contracts from Duke Energy, and progress reports from state entities like the Department of Environmental Quality and NGOs like the Environmental Defense Fund. And this was a pretty huge undertaking. But ultimately, what I found is quite simple. The history of climate goals in North Carolina is a story of a few big steps forward, a few big steps backward, and a lot of compromise along the way. And I created a whole timeline, and I'd be happy to share it with anyone who is interested after today's webinar. But for the purpose of keeping things concise today, I'll just tell you about a few landmark moments. So the first big thing was in 2007, Senate Bill 3, which really set North Carolina's first clean energy milestone goal and established a standard for the incorporation of renewable energy sources. So that was very exciting. And then you have Executive Order 80, 11 years later, where Governor Roy Cooper established North Carolina's commitment to follow through on Paris Agreement goals, which is pretty cool, and set up the task forces to really make it happen. And then you have House Bill 951, which was called the Omnibus Bill because it was just a huge bill and involved a lot of compromise and concessions to Duke Energy. But it also required North Carolina Utilities Commission to take all reasonable steps toward a 70% carbon dioxide reduction by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. But again, this bill was kind of one of the biggest compromises that North Carolina has ever made, and it established a guaranteed profit band for Duke Energy, among other concessions. And then you have Senate Bill 678, which changed the previous standards set by Senate Bill 3, allowing the inclusion of nuclear and fusion energy into the resource planning portfolio, despite their non-renewable classification. And then finally, you have the Power Bill Reduction Act in 2025, which contradicted earlier House Bill 951 by removing the 2030 interim milestone requirement. Basically, the North Carolina General Assembly was in favor of letting go of carbon goals to keep energy supply diverse and cost to utilities low. But this actually meant the extension of reliance on coal plants and ultimately shifted more financial burden to ratepayers to address increasing energy demand. So let that serve as your reminder not to form your opinion of a bill based off of its name. And yeah, I feel like this is maybe a lot that I've just thrown at you, but as a student of public policy, it's really interesting for me. And I think it's important to reiterate that policy is our biggest and best opportunity to bring some of that moral progress that Pope Francis was talking about into the conversation by balancing the ethical with the ecological and the economic. So it's an opportunity that's there for us, and I'm not sure that North Carolina has necessarily taken advantage of it to the extent that it is there for us to do. Okay, so 5 questions down, 1 to go. So where do we stand with North Carolina climate goals? According to this chart from the Environmental Defense Fund, we're really far off from achieving the climate goals set by House Bill 951. This chart here shows how far off we were from achieving that 2030 target that they ultimately got rid of. But what they don't tell you about getting rid of the interim goal is that it doesn't get you any closer to achieving the long-term carbon neutrality goal. So yeah, we're really off from achieving what we set out to achieve. And then according to this greenhouse gas inventory report from the Department of Environmental Quality, natural gas and coal are pretty much where we get all of our emissions come from in the process of electricity generation. And as you can see at the bottom, we've cut down on emissions a lot since 2005, but we're really nowhere near our climate goals. And the opportunities to lean on renewables to help us get there are kind of staring us in the face, and we're not going for them. And that makes you have to ask, is this what North Carolina wants, or is this what's being offered as the best technological and economic option by a regulated monopoly? Okay, so 6 questions done. We're almost there. Yay. But knowing what we know now, what do we do about data centers? Especially knowing that North Carolina is already so far off from achieving its climate goals, it's really concerning to think that the data center boom may throw us off course even more. So what do we do about it? How can we help moral progress catch up to technological progress? And what can we do to protect ourselves? First, we need to pay attention to and weigh in on new legislation. Senate Bill 730 is currently on the floor in North Carolina. And as I mentioned before, names can be deceiving, and this name does not tell the whole story. This bill contains some positive measures on data centers, like noise and resource impact assessments, but it doesn't close the tax loopholes or protect ratepayers from significant grid update costs. And the bill also pins the retirement of coal-fired power plants on the creation of new nuclear plants instead of things like wind and solar. Now, moratoriums are also another really strong option that we have to give moral progress a chance to catch up to the technological. And we have, I was there for a moratorium being put in place in Durham County, which was super exciting to see. This summer, I actually attended several hearings on data center moratoriums, which were super interesting. As you can see from these pictures that I took, sometimes they're very contentious, and the police, there were a lot of arrests at this one hearing that I went to, which was really impactful to witness. But from these hearings, I also learned that the role of a moratorium is not actually to push off something that you ultimately want to ban. That's kind of a misuse of a moratorium. But rather, it is to allow for more time and space for policy and moral progress to catch up to innovation, which is kind of exactly what we've been talking about with the encyclical. So it is a really good option. And then next, establishing environmental protections is another way that we can mitigate the impact of data centers. We didn't get a chance to talk about this in this presentation at all, but energy access is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the impact of data centers. And as I'm sure many of you know, North Carolina has been in drought conditions this whole summer, And so you really have to ask if this is the appropriate environment for water-intensive data centers to be um, growing in the state. Um, and then you also need to support policy that shifts infrastructure costs to the loads that create them. Very excitingly, North Carolina, or not North Carolina, New York and Texas have some legislation like this that just went into effect, and we should try and sort of copy that here. And then finally, when possible, if you can afford to, it's important to take individual actions like optimizing your home for energy efficiency. And a really cool plug, or a plug for a really cool program that the Council of Churches offers to churches. They have a volunteer energy savings analysis team that will go to your church and perform an energy audit and help churches to cut down on their energy costs, which is very cool. So that was a lot of information. There's a lot more work to do. Something really cool about the data center issue is that people on both sides of the political aisle are really concerned about how data centers will impact them. And I think it's rare that an issue so contentious can bring together people across political divides, but it really presents a huge opportunity for meaningful policy to be put in place. Unfortunately, whether or not we like it, data centers and AI are probably not going anywhere. But if we can use this moment as an opportunity to direct more funding toward renewable energy projects, that would be really awesome. On this slide, I have two photos of the notes that I took on the first day that I met with Susanna this summer, all about North Carolina energy. And now I've really filled in a lot of the gaps since the beginning, which is really cool to see and look back and see how much I've learned. But we're coming to time, and today is the last day of my internship with the Council of Churches. I've really learned so much from this work and from the Bridge program overall. And thank you for coming to this webinar because it's been such a special way to share some of what I've learned this summer. So thank you so much for being here. And also a huge, huge, huge thank you to Susanna for mentoring me this summer and really just passing along so much knowledge and care in the process. It's been amazing. The work is far from done. I'm really excited to take what I've learned this summer into my future work and projects. And to end the same way I started this presentation, my next big project is going to be making my way through Pope Leo's new encyclical, which is all about AI. And if anyone is interested in joining me, I'd be happy to, do a little book club type thing and discuss along the way. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I will pass it back to Susanna now.
Oh my goodness, Georgia. Truly, for the love of this world, this presentation is just incredible. I mean, the opportunity to work with you this summer truly has been one of the greatest blessings that I've received. I've been at the council since 2011, and I've worked with lots of different people over the period of time, and you came into my life at the right time because there's a lot of change going on at the council in the world. And I so had hoped that we would have enough time. 8 weeks flew by, and y'all,
Yeah.
for a good part of that, I was out of North Carolina. I was on vacation. I was traveling. I just, the ability for Georgia to lead this work. This is really, really a masterpiece. I mean, I said it in the chat and I look forward to our discussion portion, but the ability to take the amount of information that Georgia attempted to even touch the surface on and get to the level of depth that you were able to, and now to have provided this recording and this resource for all North Carolinians. I know some folks in the Zoom room are anxiously awaiting the resources that you put together, and I truly you are a blessing, and it's just been an honor to work with you. So reminder to the folks that are on the Zoom and then to folks watching at home afterwards, this will be on the council's YouTube channel, so we will send that out, post it on social media. I hope everyone will share it also. There's some really good questions in the chat. We're going to have a rich discussion afterwards. So if you didn't make it today, sorry, you missed that part of the recording. But this is ongoing, as Georgia had said, and we had both thought that we would have the time to read Pope Leo's encyclical this summer. Also need to start it, but that these encyclicals are really resources for a lifetime. So if you haven't yet read Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, for our common home, it's just an amazing, amazing document. Truly, these are gifts from God. I do believe that. So we are going to close out together with an affirmation. And Georgia and I will both read it aloud. If you stay on mute so it doesn't get too wonky sounding, you're also welcome to read them to yourself at home or listen to our voice as we close out the recording part of the portion today. So again, just so grateful you're all here and for the evergreen resource that we have of this recording. Because we embrace faith and spirituality, we are grounded in the interconnectedness of the sacred, the natural world, and one another.
Because we embrace justice, we act with inclusion and respect, working in solidarity with vulnerable and marginalized communities.
Because we embrace hope, we are empowered to live into our vision for the world with present and future generations.
Because we embrace courage, we speak with a prophetic voice to create equity and restore wholeness to all.
We do this all in the name of love. May the power of peace be with us all. So thank you so much.
Thank you.